So it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Anthony Edwards, whose work I've known for 40 years, I think now, as someone interested in population. Anthony, tell me where and when you were born.
I'm a Londoner. I'm London Welsh. I was born up the Edgware Road, as a matter of fact, since you ask. And
When?
on October the 4th, 1935.
Right. So, as I mentioned, I'm very interested in ancestry, as you are. Usually people have some knowledge of their grandparents and maybe even further. Could you tell me something about the branches of your family?
Not much, partly because I really haven't shown a great deal of interest in it. When I tell you that my four quarterings are Edwards, Jones and Phillips, you'll understand the difficulty of trying to trace. But I do know that going back as far as my grandparents and my great-grandparents, one of the Edwardses stems from North Devon as a blacksmith, and with the name Edwards, that means he will probably have gone to North Devon from South Wales looking for work at some stage, or his ancestors will have done. The other Edwards was a colliery engine driver in Wrexham in North Wales, so the Edwardses come from different parts. And then my mother was a Phillips, and the Phillipses are very much concentrated in Pembrokeshire in West Wales, and they were stonemasons. So I come from 3 generations back, I suppose, of typical artisan working people from Wales.
Great. Well, coming down to your grandparents, did you know them personally?
I knew my Edwards grandfather, and I knew my Phillips grandmother. I never saw my Edwards grandmother, and my Phillips grandfather I saw once, more or less on his deathbed. No direct influences, except a liking for blackberries from my grandmother.
From your grandmother. That's a nice meme to carry on. So coming down then to your parents, tell me about your parents and their effect on you and character.
Well, my parents, Harold Edwards was a London surgeon, ultimately, born in Newport, and his father, of whom I've spoken, started off in the steel works but ended up by being the best piano teacher in Newport as a profession. And my parents met through music because our mother was a pupil of my grandfather, and that's how she met my father. And this was during the First World War. Father then went off in the Royal Engineers to the Western Front and survived that. And he then started medicine after the war, became a well-known London surgeon by the time the next war came, where he became a brigadier in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he was the man who introduced to the front in the Italian campaign the use of the newfangled penicillin, for which he is remembered. This all meant that I knew very little about my parents. I remember very little about my parents from until I was about 10, because being brought up in the Second World War, Father was away and mother was mostly in hospital. She suffered very much from tuberculosis and the consequential medical treatment, which involved big operations in those days. So I had no home, so I was schooled at one or another boarding school. And from my parents, I just had no direct influence until the family was reconstituted after the war. Father came back from the army in 1945, was able to set up his practice in Harley Street again, and eventually, of course, the National Health Service started. So from 1948 onwards, he was in employment rather than self-employment for the first time.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
I have a brother, and this is quite important to my development, John Hilton Edwards, who eventually became Professor of Genetics in Oxford and is known for the discovery of trisomy 18 in man shortly after the discovery of Down syndrome, which is trisomy 21. So John Edwards is carried by his syndrome.
Was he older or younger?
Oh, he was 7.5 years older than me. And this has made quite a big difference because it meant that I didn't have much contact with him either until I came up to Cambridge, and he was already then practicing medicine, and he became one of the early proponents of human genetics. And he was quite well educated mathematically too, so he then started to influence me, and we spent a lot of time together at meetings of various scientific societies, and in some ways we were very alike, so much so physically that when our average age was about 50, we used to get confused at meetings with each other. And certainly one occasion we were most delightfully confused because we were going up in a lift in a genetics meeting in Rome, just chatting away with a Swedish friend, Jan Lindsten, geneticist, when the lift stopped at a floor and somebody got in whom Jan Lindsten thought ought to be introduced to the two Edwards brothers. And he did so by saying, "Oh, how nice to see you, Bob," or whatever his name was. "Let me introduce you to my two friends here. They are the two most confused scientists in genetics."
Nice. Right, well, a thing I often ask is, and sometimes revealing, what is your first memory, and at what age were you when you had a strong, distinct memory that you can recall?
I have a strong memory of a famous event. The event was the outbreak of war in 1939, and immediately I was to be evacuated to South Wales from our home in London. And I remember standing on what must have been a pier on the ferry to take me across the River Severn. No bridges then. I don't know who I was with. But I wasn't yet 4 years old, and I was being put on a boat to go somewhere. I didn't know where, of course. But I did ask the question why, and I was told it was because war had broken out. So I remember the outbreak of war.
Very good. The other question, which is sometimes indicative, is when you were a little older than that, say between about 6 and 8, that sort of time, did you have any particular enthusiasms or hobbies or things that you really loved doing as a child?
Well, I was a bit of a loner as a child. Let me see, that will still have been before I went to my prep school.
Yeah.
But I can remember thinking quite hard about one or two things. I was at a nursery school which had been evacuated to North Devon to a hotel in Woolacombe. And the hotel is at the top of a sort of shelving, flat piece of grass, which must have been a beach at one stage, and then the land presumably moved up, and then you come to the rocks of Woolacombe Beach and so forth. And this was gently sloping down from the hotel. And I can remember wandering there by myself, imagining what it would be like trying to design a railway to go up the contour and sort of working out the optimum way to do this. Mathematician's hill climbing technique. And yes, I was mathematically inclined.
Yeah. Well, Sir Peter Swinnerton Dyer told me that his mother used to set him a mathematical problem when he was 2 to get him to have a bath. So it starts early. So, did you collect things at all? Were you a butterfly collector?
Nothing particular, just what other people did, stamps and so on. Very educative they were too in those Empire days.
Yeah. And were you beginning to read at that time, before prep school? Or
I'm sorry, where was
beginning to read books?
I just can't remember anything about reading books at a nursery school. By the time I got to my prep school, there was quite strict compulsory reading. So I must have learned to read pretty well at my earlier school.
You mentioned what might indicate a rather lonely childhood. In other words, your parents are absent, your brother's absent. During that time, did you feel isolated and lonely?
Well, I didn't know how to have feelings like that at the time, really. At least I don't know how to remember that one might have had feelings like that, because I supposed I was just the same as anybody else. The fact that I might be not quite the same as everybody else sort of did begin to dawn on me at my prep school. I did seem to have more academic interests, and I may say that certain political interests too. For example, I was showing a great interest in science, and this was principally because my brother had passed on a present that he'd had from a family member, which was a book of astronomy, and he'd passed it on to me when I was about 8, I suppose. I still possess that book, actually, so I can check these dates. A big fat book with all the information about the planets and plans of the stars and so forth. I mean, of the night sky. a lot of charts and a lot of reading to do, and a lot of explaining. And that interested me a great deal. So I started thinking, well, why am I not being taught any of these scientific things? And I remember talking to Mr. Bedford, who was teaching English, and saying to him, look, it's all very well learning all about the literature of the past, but we don't have any science in this school. And he said, well, you and your friends who are talking about this, you ought to go and see the headmaster. So I led a deputation to the headmaster, and I received the classic answer, which I was going to come across later in my academic career, that there was no time in the syllabus for extra material. Well, my reaction to this was to start an astronomy society, and so that I was made to give a talk, astronomical talk. I was very well supported by one of the teachers. I don't know what she was normally teaching, but she used on starlit nights, she would be quite keen to take a group of boys and sort of point out the obvious things in the heavens. So I decided that yes, I would give a talk, and I managed, I suppose with the help of a teacher, to get hold of some slides from some service or other which provided hired slides, and I gave my talk, and I then wrote it up as a book. And I remember in the handicraft lesson I managed to give it a hard cover as well. And I owned that book for many, many, many years, but with great regret, I no longer have it. I don't know what happened to it. So yes, I wanted to be a scientist.
You haven't told us where and what this school was called.
I'm sorry?
What was this prep school?
It was a little school, also moved for the duration of the war, and which never went back to Sussex, moved to North Devon, so it was close by, whereas my first school was at Woolacombe, which is north of Barnstaple. The other one was at a place called Torstock Court, a stately home, about 2.5 miles south of Barnstaple. So I spent a lot of my childhood in Devon, in North Devon.
Was the school keen on games? Did you play games there?
Well, some of the boys did, but I wasn't any good at them. Oh yes, it was a normal prep school which did all the normal things, and so we learnt to play cricket, and we learnt to play hockey, and I don't recall any rugby, but there was nothing like tennis or anything else like that. So it was pretty basic, but the grounds of this the estate surrounding the house were full of wonderful trees to climb and places to explore, and a delightful place to spend one's time.
So on the whole, you were happy there?
Did I have?
You were happy at the school?
I think so, yes, because I was sort of moderately successful there in school terms, in coming top in mathematics and that sort of thing. And I had good friends, so yes, that was rather a success. But I was exceptionally well taught by several people, particularly Mr. Wood, the mathematician. And I liked the mathematics very much. I was usually top of the class, and when he set papers and so forth, I would finish them before everybody else, and so he would get me doing extracurricular things. For example, I became a dab hand at solving trigonometric identities. Well, not every prep school boy gets into trigonometrical identities, But I enjoyed proving them enormously, and it appealed to my to my sense of geometry. I visualised my mathematics, and that was going to be quite influential later on.
Right. Well, let's go on to your next school. Where was that? And
That was Uppingham.
all right.
And there also the teaching was exceptional, but it was uniformly exceptional in the sciences. The teachers who had taught my brother at the same school before, we didn't overlap in school, of course, being 7.5 years apart, but the great stability of the teaching staff meant that they remembered John Edwards very well, so I was a sort of marked man once I got there. But the teaching on the physics and mathematics side, I now see was absolutely exceptional. I thought it was the norm, of course, but it was absolutely exceptional. Particularly on the mathematical side, where I was introduced to various mathematical concepts which were well outside the A-level syllabus, which indeed turned out to be practically useful in my scientific work later on. Things like trilinear coordinates and other peculiar activities, projective geometry, for example. Spherical trigonometry I was fascinated by. Triangles which have 3 right angles in the corners, things like that.
So, one thing that happens at public school like that is about the age of 14 or 15, many boys are confirmed into the Church.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing this bit.
Many people are confirmed into the Church of England around 14 or 15. Were you confirmed?
I was confirmed, but when was it?
When you were about 15, I suppose.
I suppose it was when I was Uppingham, yes.
About 1950.
Yes.
This takes one to the question of your parents and your religious interests or lack of interest.
Well, my parents, I should say, were Baptists.
Yeah.
But my mother particularly was a very devout woman, and when she came to live in England, well, when the family was reconstituted in London after the war, she was confirmed into the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
And my religious development is a very straightforward English public school, middle of the road Anglican development, bolstered with the liturgy and the authorised version of the Bible, which has affected my own language and writing in a way which I can identify even today. So culturally it was an important, and for a school like Uppingham, a universal culture that existed there that nobody questioned very much. It was part of the fabric. And of course it was to a greater extent than today a part of the fabric of England anyway.
And did that continue through your life till now?
Did it continue to?
Through your life until the present?
Well, in an intellectual sense, yes. And I'm quite fond of reading the opinions of scientists. One of my nephews, who actually married a Roman Catholic, has produced a collection of articles, sermons and so forth, on their Christian belief, published by scientists. And I belong to that sort of school where I remember once saying at a discussion of this kind, I don't believe in belief, I'm a scientist, but I accept as a pattern for living a great deal of what I've learned from the Christian Church, and I respect it.
I interviewed John Polkinghorne. You knew John Polkinghorne?
I knew him slightly, yes. I'm Trinity Hall originally, by the way.
Yeah, well, he was at Queen's, I think. He combined...
Yeah, he was in Trinity Hall at a time, wasn't he?
Yeah,
yes.
Later he went to be dean. And he wrote quite a bit about how he believed that science and religion were compatible with each other.
Yes.
Is that your view too?
Well, I don't think they're comparable. So in that sense, being incomparable, they're not incompatible. I don't...
You're not of the Richard Dawkins persuasion?
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm more... You're going to get me on to R.A. Fisher, who is one of the people whose writings have appeared in my nephew's book.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with me, of course. Another is Tony Hewish's. Another is Neville Mott's. I mean, these are... these are all Keans, come to think of it, who are explaining their position. But I'm very attracted by Fisher's sermons because they are models of intellectual analysis which I would recommend to anybody who is interested in the compatibility or otherwise of Christianity and science. I'd also recommend a book by my fairly new friend Robert Asher called Science and Christianity, perhaps. My copy happens to be on my table at the moment in the house because it is an exceptionally articulate account of the compatibility of Christianity with evolution. And one can learn an enormous amount of the theory of evolution from Robert's analysis because he's an absolutely first-class paleontologist. So yes, I belong to that school.
Right. The other thing you mentioned earlier, you became a bit of a politician in setting up the Astronomy Society. Did you continue as a politician at your public school in any way?
No, not at all. In fact, I can say that quite positively because I can remember there was a general election at the time, and the arrangement was that we would all have to argue from one side or the other in connection with the election. So there were rousing speeches from various people from every point of view. A lot of it put on, of course, but this was an educational activity. I took no part in this at all.
Well, since then, you may not have been a kind of politician with a capital P in the national sense, but you've engaged in a huge amount of academic politics throughout your life. So did you learn any of your skills in debating in the...
Well, I was thrown in at the deep end on that. I suppose I have a sort of legalistic turn of mind, and I'm prepared to argue. But I was thrown in at the deep end because of the peculiar circumstances in which I found myself in Cambridge. It's jumping ahead for a bit now, but when I graduated, I then did a PhD here in Cambridge, and I then was in Italy for 3 years, and then a year in Stanford in California, and then I was a senior lecturer in statistics in Aberdeen, and I became disillusioned with what was available for me in Aberdeen. And one day I happened to see a notice in the Times, which in those days I think twice a week had academic advertisements on page 2. It had other advertisements on page 1, you will remember, and I think it had academic posts on page 2, sort of twice a week. And I saw one for a bi-fellowship at Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge, which was not my first college. A bi-fellowship in medicine or science for 2 years. And I thought, if I could get that, I could probably use the time to get myself a permanent appointment somewhere else, well, somewhere, but not Aberdeen. So I applied for it, and I got it. And during that time, the 2 years, I also got an appointment in the postgraduate medical school, which was, in the eyes of the people who appointed me, to provide statistical advice in the clinical school. But I had that possibility given to me by the Professor of Human Ecology, Leslie Banks, in whose department it was going to be. You might even remember him. Professor of Human Ecology, ran the little place at Fenners, the Department of Human Ecology. And he more or less offered it to me. So I wasn't actually interviewed at all for it. And I didn't put in a formal application. No, I did put in a formal application for it. Of course, he made me do that, explaining what I wanted to do, what I wanted to use the post for, not knowing that in the view of the clinical school, the post was to be used for providing statistical advice. So this was the beginnings of a big explosion, because I knew one thing, and the people who appointed me expected another thing. And I later came to understand that it was I had been placed by Leslie Banks in that position because he was deeply unhappy at his time in Cambridge, and he felt that his efforts to establish a Department of Human Ecology had not been fully appreciated. And only in later years have I discovered that he was actually a very influential person in the foundation and setting up of the clinical school. We're talking about the 1970s now.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's rather a side issue. So I took up the post when my 2 years at Caius was over. And I was immediately elected into a fellowship at Caius on the basis of my university post. Well, after a week or two, my colleague Carpenter was his name, in human ecology, who was providing statistical advice for the clinical school, asked me if I would provide advice to Dr. So-and-so as though it was part of my job. Well, of course, nobody had told me that it was part of my job. So what I was doing was practicing what I said I would do in the application that I had made, which is to continue my work in mathematical genetics, human genetics side generally. The fact that I'd been a senior lecturer in statistics meant, of course, that people would think that I was very happy to teach statistics. Well, indeed, in Aberdeen, I taught, I did indeed teach medical statistics, but I didn't know that that was what I was supposed to be doing here in Cambridge. Okay, to cut a long story short, I was an assistant director of research, and the regulations expected me to be reappointed after 5 years, and then there would be another 5 years, and then it would be an appointment to the retiring age. And it was well known that ADRs, as we called them, quite frequently became readers because they were basically on the research side. At least that was the idea. Well, after a little while, 3 years or so, I suppose, my reappointment at the end of my first 5 years came up, and I received a letter from the Secretary General telling me that I would only be reappointed for 2 years, and then my post would be discontinued. Well, that was a bit of a shock. And so, of course, quite a lot of arguments started. The consequence of this argument was that I became interested in what the powers were, what the statutes said for somebody in my position. And I sought advice in college, of course. Great advantage being a fellow of Keys. And I was told to go and look in the Book of Statutes, and I found out exactly what the position was. And then it turned out that the Secretary General was the Secretary and acting on the authority of a body called the General Board, which I was told was a very powerful body. Yes, this was true. And then I discovered that there was about to be an election to the General Board. So I thought, well, I'll stand. I'm not putting up with this nonsense. So, election was by the members of the faculty boards in Group 4, which included archaeology and anthropology, incidentally, and medicine. And there was a vacant seat. And by an arrangement with the veterinary school, the clinical school had the turn now on a sort of Buggins turn arrangement. But between the vet school and the clinical school, it was actually the vet school's turn within that Buggins turn arrangement in Group 4. And the vets had put up somebody as their candidate whom the medical faculty were not entirely happy with. So I thought, well, I'd like to stand in this. I need someone to propose for me. So I asked Professor John Thoday in genetics, and he gave me a very good piece of advice. He said, I will do, but it won't do you any good because you have to get somebody from your own faculty to propose you. And I said, thank you very much, John, that's very good advice. So I consulted a member of my faculty, quite well informed as to what went on in the faculty, who was a colleague at Fenner's in the Department of Human Ecology. And he said, well, why don't you ask the Regius Professor of Physics? I think he knows what's going on. His name I should be able to remember, but it would take me Joe, takes me too long to retrieve it from my memory. So I rang him up. And he said, no, I couldn't possibly help you. Couldn't possibly. And then there was a pause on the telephone. And he said, have you got a list of the faculty members here, the faculty board members? And I said, yes. He said, read the names out. And I started reading through the names. And when I came to Austin Gresham, Professor of Morbid Anatomy, Joe, oh, what on earth is his name?
Doesn't matter.
It's not, I shouldn't waste time on it. I want to say Thompson, it's not Thompson, it's a name like that though. Anyway, he said, ring up Austin Gresham. So I rang up Austin Gresham and he said, yes, come up immediately. So I leapt on my bicycle and cycled up to the clinical school, up against a deadline of 5 o'clock to hand his note in. And I raced back down Hills Road because I really was just up against the 5 o'clock deadline. And as I got to the old schools, the man who was the secretary of the Cavendish Laboratory, a friend of mine, happened to be standing in the old school's courtyard. And I shouted out to him, look at your watch, note the time, note that I'm coming here in, please, I may need it as evidence. And when I got into the old schools, there was the registrar and the draftsman standing as though expecting, just wanting to go home, but they thought they'd better wait till 5 o'clock. And I turned up with my piece of paper. Okay, so I stood in the election. And when the election took place, I happened to be in London that day. So when I came back from London, I went to the notice board at the Senate House to see who'd won, and there was no notice. So I thought, this is very funny. So the next morning I rang up my friend Charles Goodhart, who I think was at that time a member of the council, sometime senior proctor from Keys. I said, what do I do now? He said, what you must do is, since you're entitled to watch the count of the vote, you must ring up the Angus Macpherson, the registry, and say, since the count evidently is continuing, I'd like to come and watch it. Well, Angus, with whom I was on quite good terms, said, I think I'd better tell you what's happened. Jack Linnett, the Vice-Chancellor, had indeed counted the votes. So that there were 18 votes. It's this very small election, of course, just the members of the faculty boards. No, there were 36 votes, and the answer was 18 for me and 18 for the other person. So Jack Leonard didn't feel like taking a decision until the next day, when he had to take the decision. And what he did was to put our two names into an envelope, or more precisely to get his secretary, who was a Danish lady who was a friend of my Swedish wife, so we knew exactly what was going on, put our two names into an envelope and draw one out, and I won. So I joined the General Board. Everything was very correct and proper. And so I just started as a member of the General Board. But my case had kept on coming back to the General Board, you see, so they had to censor the minutes which I was given as a member of the General Board of the last few meetings, because they involved me. And they kept on sending me out of the room, whilst the problem of me, and there were 4 other people involved in potentially losing their posts because they did not have tenure in the old postgraduate medical school and were doing ancillary things like being chemists to the hospital or being statisticians and so forth. Anyway, the whole system sort of moved backwards and we were all saved. And I was the ringleader because it happened that my reappointment was the first one to come up. So I found myself doing 4 years on the General Board. And the system discovered that I could read and write and help them do things. So in no time at all, I became the chairman of the General Purposes Committee, dealing with all the regulations and examination of problems and so forth. And I became interested in the system. That's how I got involved. I suppose the most delightful thing about the whole process was not only winning it, but I really did win it in a big way, because they had then discovered what I was actually good at, and whereas the others became lecturers, I became a reader. They made me a reader. And being a reader was quite something in those days, as you will remember. But what was the additional delight was that at one point I was shown the advertisement in the Reporter for the Post, and a sort of finger was pointed at it because it said that the post was for a mathematician. And I said, I'm not a mathematician. I didn't read mathematics. I'm a geneticist. I wasn't eligible for that post. You made a mistake, but you gave it to me. Anyway, that's a very long story which comes out of your question. So I just became interested, and I had a very strong sense of what is right and what is wrong. And some things I didn't like and I thought they were wrong, and I used to argue about them. And I'm still arguing about them.
Well, as we're on that, and we'll be having a break in a minute, let's continue on that, because you've written a lot of articles about university politics in Cambridge. And some of the things I remember out of them, one was that you felt that there's been a backslipping in...
One that is...
There's been a backslipping or degradation,
yes,
of Cambridge governance.
Yes.
And that's one impression I got. The other was that compared to Oxford, Cambridge has done less well in terms of democratic governance.
Well, I can very straightforwardly comment on that, because your latter point is one that I felt quite strongly at the beginning of the process. I had the impression that Oxford was a more it was more run by the heads of houses and less by the administrative officers, and that it was. I was very impressed by the Franks report, of course, which I studied, and with statements like that it is essential that a governing body should have the ability to put down motions, and that is a fundamental requirement for democratic government. But I don't hold that view now of the current states of the two universities, because for a variety of reasons, Cambridge has managed to maintain a stronger sense of operating as a democracy with the Regent House as its centrepiece, as its governing body, than Oxford has. As you may read in the Oxford magazine, week after week after week, there are people deploring the fact that Oxford's congregation is almost dead. Well, Cambridge's Regent House is not dead, but I think there has been a degradation, to use your word, a very serious degradation, accelerated by the decisions and recommendations of the Wass Syndicate of the Cambridge democracy, which I think worked exceptionally well from its instigation in 1926, almost up to the time of Wass. And Wass was an attempt which was originally proposed by me to try and stop the degradation which I was concerned about, and comes through my work not only in what I was writing for the Oxford magazine, more or less after I'd ceased to be members of the council and the general board and so forth, but which will be seen in the many interventions I made in Regent House discussions, which are a corpus much more extensive than my epistles to the Oxonians. And had I not become seriously involved in combating the appalling way in which the reputation of my teacher, R.A. Fisher, has been treated, first of all, by the Americans, and subsequently, I'm ashamed to say, by places closer to home, I would have spent my time in retirement writing about the decline of the Cambridge democracy, blow by blow.
Is it too late to do that?
Is it too late for me to do the writing, or is
Yes.
it too late to stop it?
No, to do the writing.
Well, that depends on things which are not under my control.
Because it's very important. As you know, we have published a book by Robert Foley,
Yes.
which analyses some of the elements of what has happened recently in the last 20 years, and something by you, an overview of what has gone wrong, would be really very valuable.
Well, I think Robert's book is absolutely brilliant. It's the sort of book, and I'm not the only person who has said this, that you sit down and you read it, and then you read it again. It's just the right length, and it's beautifully written, and absolutely an insider's view from a very perceptive person. And I think it's wonderful.
Good. Let's have a break there, and then in the next part we'll talk more about, well, we'll take you to university and then to your work and R.A. Fisher. Okay?
Yes.
Let's continue. We got you to the end of Uppingham, You came to Cambridge, presumably, and what did you read at Cambridge?
I came hoping to read the mathematical tripos, but my A-level results were not good enough for Trinity Hall. So I had, as it happens, taken the Cambridge Mechanical Sciences qualifying examination, which in the sixth form in Uppingham on the science side, we boys would be put into in our first year in the 2-year six, just as an exam which would keep us amused for that year, otherwise there would be no exams that year. And I'd taken and passed that. So when I arrived in Trinity Hall, I was down to do mechanical sciences. I wasn't really aware that mechanical sciences was just engineering. I somehow had the idea that there would be physics and so forth in it. So I went to my tutor and said, I really don't want to be an engineer. I want to be a physicist. So he said, well, that's fine. Don't go and see Dr. Smith. Go and see Dr. Bloggs instead, and we'll turn you into a physicist. That's fine. So I read part 1 physics and the things that go with it, like metallurgy and crystallography and so forth. I also tried to do the whole subject mathematics in the natural sciences tripos. But my maths teacher, Sean Wiley, very soon concluded that I wasn't up to doing that. So I got downgraded to doing half subject mathematics, and I had to find myself another half subject. And I chose history and philosophy of science, which is where my history and philosophy of science interest started. And one of the things that I remember is that I stopped going to the philosophy lectures because I was being taught about induction, scientific induction, but nobody was mentioning statistical inference, induction as seen from the point of view of statistics. And I had knowledge of a book called Statistical Methods for Research Workers by R.A. Fisher, which I'd been advised to look at when I spent 6 months at the Royal Greenwich Observatory in what would now be called a gap year. So I stopped going to those lectures, but I flourished nevertheless in history and philosophy of science. And then it was necessary to think of a part 2. Well, this is where my aforementioned brother came in with his influence. I'd had the idea, I wanted to be a school teacher, and I'd had the idea that I'd discovered under the Cambridge regulations that I could take part 1 of the mathematical tripos in my 3rd year, and I would get a degree on the basis of 2 part 1s. And that, in fact, would have been a very good training for a school teacher, physics and mathematics. And John said to me, you should do a Cambridge part 2. It's a waste of Cambridge not to do a part 2. And I realised in later years that that was because he never did a part 2. He had this very distinguished scientific career, but he never had a part 2. He was a medical student, and he'd got a 3rd in each year that he was in Cambridge. He was clearly an atypical highly intelligent student who just didn't learn the way other people were being taught. So he left Cambridge. I think father was not too pleased, and he advised me to do a part two. So I went to Weatherhead's in the marketplace, the then newsagents, and I bought a copy of The Reporter for the first time in my life. Not the last, I may say. And looked at the lecture list, which, to the eternal shame of the university, is no longer printed, of course. Historically, a fabulous document, the Cambridge lecture lists. I've got every copy of The Reporter back to 1870 in my college room still, my former college room. Wonderful resource. Anyway, so I started looking through and I came across part two, through the natural science part twos, I came across genetics. John had sort of mentioned genetics. It was very early days for human genetics then, but I knew what genetics must be about. And I discovered that one of the lecturers was Sir Ronald Fisher. And I thought, oh, just a minute. He wrote that book I saw when I was being an astronomer, Statistical Methods for Research Workers. And I understand he's a famous statistician, but I thought he was a contemporary of Isaac Newton or something like that. I had no idea. And what's he doing teaching genetics anyway? And there was a little footnote in the Reporter which said that students contemplating reading Part 2 genetics should consult Dr. Wallace or Dr. Owen at the Department of Genetics, 44 Storey's Way, before the division of the Easter term. Okay, so I got on my bicycle. I went up, I found 44 Storey's Way, and it is the former house of the Arthur Balfour Professor, of course. Private house, large private house, provided by the benefactors of that chair. And the front door was open, and curiously enough, the next door beyond the front door was open, which was the door of a little office. And I could see somebody sitting in there who I thought must be the hall porter, because he was the sort of first human being I encountered. And this person looked at me and said, "Who are you?" So I was clutching my Reporter, and so I read the footnote, and he said, "Oh, I'm Professor Fisher, I'll do. What do you want?" So I said, well, I was wondering about the possibility of reading Part 2 genetics. Oh, he said, come out into the garden, let's talk about it. So the two of us went out into the garden, which was a beautiful place because it was full of experimental plots, as well as strawberries and other nice things in the Easter term. So we sort of chatted, and I don't remember anything of what Fisher was saying. That's terrible, because I've had no reason in the years afterwards to reinforce my memory by talking to anybody about it. All I can remember is that I had to be very careful as we walked up and down the paths, the grass paths between the experimental plots, to guess which way Fisher was going to turn when we got to the T-junction at the end. Well, after being totally fascinated by whatever it was he was saying, 2 hours passed, and he turned to me and he said, "Oh, that was very interesting." I'm not aware of having said anything, but of course he must have been quizzing me. And he said, come back tomorrow afternoon and we'll continue the conversation. Well, of course, I eagerly came back the next day. And he said, yes, I think I'm prepared to take you. You must come in the long vacation term to look at the flowers. Okay, that was my admission to Part 2 genetics. I was the only student who had applied because I'd completely bypassed the normal process of talking to your director of studies, talking to your tutor and so forth. And Fisher's Department of Genetics was regarded as a very odd place, rather suspiciously by the zoologists and the botanists, who thought that he was trespassing on their preserves, trying to do his genetics as a sort of separate activity. Anyway, so I turned up in the middle of the long vacation, and he again said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, you told me to come and look at the flowers." And he pulled from his desk an off-print, which I won't waste time by going and getting my copy of, well, my original copy of a very complicated mathematical genetics paper. And he said, when you've read that, come back and I'll give you something else. Well, it was totally incomprehensible. I mean, not only had I no biological background, so I barely knew what a gene was. I mean, I just hadn't heard of Mendel or anything. But also the mathematics that he was using to solve the problem that he was considering was far beyond my knowledge of mathematics, all to do with the theory of partitions. Okay, well, never mind, it all ended happily, and I ended up with a career in genetics.
So when you went back to see him, did you say, I didn't understand a word of what you gave me? And he said, oh, don't worry, here's another piece, or what?
No, I didn't catch that.
When you went back
Yes.
and said, I don't understand a word of what you've just given me to read, he said, it doesn't matter, why not have another piece?
No, he didn't actually say that. I don't think I ever admitted to him that I didn't really understand it. I forget the sequence of operations then, but it was the first experience of the technique that Fisher would adopt with students. He was not a direct teacher of things. He was a brilliant creative of interest in you solving the problem without necessarily helping you to solve it. I now see, after the event, that was his trick. It wasn't a trick, it was just the way he worked. So he had a most tremendous impression on people through giving them ideas and letting them work things out for themselves.
Well, tell me more about Fisher, because he's had such an influence on your life as a person and as a researcher and a theoretician. Anything you like?
Well, in a way, there's so much to tell that I can only describe the level which he thinks at. He was thinking ahead of the pack all the time and thinking more deeply than anybody else. But he was also equipped mathematically to follow up these thoughts, so that the contribution that he made in both statistics and in, shall we call it, population genetics, the mathematical theory of population genetics, was not only highly original, but totally outstanding in retrospect. In statistics, he simply cleared the ground of the existing state of the subject, which had been ploughed endlessly by people like Karl Pearson, well, notably Karl Pearson, but also Edgeworth and others. And he just introduced totally new concepts from the depths of his clear thinking, which revolutionized the way we do statistics, introducing a whole new vocabulary at the same time, a new way of looking at things, new concepts of what we mean by information, which are specific to real information, informativeness, measures of informativeness, in a sense in which Shannon's more famous and later concept of information is simply a measure of the amount of information that a channel can carry, and makes no comment and isn't interested in whether the information means anything at all. It can either be a coded important message expressed as noughts and ones, or it can be a random series of noughts and ones. Shannon information thinks these two are the same. But Fisher information is a way of describing how informative a statistical analysis is. And it goes on, of course, to an understanding of how to design an experiment to make it as informative as possible. So the whole of the concept of design of experiments is a complete further development from Fisher's concepts of estimation and information and so forth. It's absolutely mind-boggling. He is, well, the best way I can describe his eminence and what should be his fame is what has been said by a well-known Danish statistician, Anders Hald, who has written the most astonishing books of the history of statistics in his retirement. I mean, if ever there was a retirement project, it's Anders Hald's 2 books on the history of statistics, history of mathematical statistics. And he simply classes Fisher with Laplace and with Gauss. That's the company that Fisher keeps, and that's just on the statistics side. And when you come on to the genetical side, the biological side, you have people like Richard Dawkins seeing him as Darwin's finest successor. So that's a measure of the man that we're dealing with.
One of the things that I think I remember he was interested in, and I'm quite vaguely interested in as a non-mathematician, was likelihood and probability. Am I right in thinking that he was one of those who developed the theories of probabilistic?
Well, I wonder if you know that my first book is called Likelihood.
No, I've forgotten.
I was so taken by Fisher's concept of likelihood, and here the influence of my brother John was quite strong too. But when you are trying to do statistics in human genetics, the paucity of data is the real problem. So you need to squeeze as much information as you can from the data that you've got, because you can't do the experiments which I've just been referring to. And so the question of efficiency, another of Fisher's words in statistics, the question of how do you get the maximum amount of information out of your data becomes absolutely critical. And this leads to a very strong interest in the principles of statistical inference. How are you supposed to operating a system so as to get these benefits from the data? And it's here that the concept of likelihood is absolutely vital. There's been a tendency, largely from wartime, to have statistical teaching dominated by the so-called Neyman-Pearson approach to statistics, which in itself is a development of Fisher's original thoughts about likelihood, incidentally. And for there to be less of an understanding of the fact that the likelihood function, as we call it, carries all the information in the data. This is rather more obvious to Bayesians, who have a different reason for being interested in likelihood. But I became fascinated in the human genetics context by the standalone concept of likelihood. So I wrote a book about it. And that book is 1972. It's been in print for 53 years now. And it was not a textbook. It was a cry of help to the offer of help to the statistical profession to take Fisher's concept of likelihood seriously. Well, I don't think the book had that effect, but other effects brought likelihood to the fore in modern work. So it's a book of its time, but I'm rather proud of it. It was the first book I wrote.
When you said that the Bayesians were interested in this for other reasons, I was working with computer scientists who were developing Bayesian search systems, Keith van Rijsbergen and people. Did their work derive ultimately from Fisher and yourself at all?
Do they work?
Did their work derive in any way the Bayesians?
Well, there's
people like Karen Needham.
Yeah, there's an absolute binding connection between the Bayesian position and likelihood, because Bayesians agree that the information that you get from your data is represented by the likelihood. Where my position and others of my thinking disagree is that we don't think you need a Bayesian background in order to interpret the likelihood. That is, we take the likelihood as it comes and look at that, and we think that the maximum likelihood, for example, the maximum likelihood value of the parameter is the thing of importance. To be a Bayesian, if you want to state the posterior probabilities of your hypotheses, which is their design, you've got to conjure up some prior probabilities to start with. Now, for geneticists, this is often quite straightforward because your prior probabilities may indeed have been derived from the Mendelian assumption in the first place. But generally speaking, you don't have any prior probabilities to get this process started. So people call themselves Bayesians when actually they're just looking at likelihoods, and their whole computer-based methods may use the notion of a Bayesian prior distribution, but basically they are extracting information by using the likelihood. So there's not too much of a difference between us. There is a tremendous difference between us, two points of view, and the people who misinterpret typical tests of significance in a way which Fisher, who was after all one of their major creators, never intended. They treat probabilities derived from tests of significance as evidence themselves. Now that's not the way to do it.
Well, I'd love to go on with that, but I want to ask you something you mentioned earlier, which was that you've spent a lot of your retirement trying to refute the criticisms and calumnies directed at Fisher, particularly by Americans. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, I can tell you. It was all started by one shout of "Fisher is a eugenicist," which originated in a changed version of his Wikipedia entry, where somebody had advanced the word eugenicist as his primary function, as opposed to statistician or biologist or geneticist. And this was repeated very quickly in American circles by the inevitable internet, and in no time at all, without doing any homework as to who Fisher was, steps were taken to remove his name from top lectures in America and to issue statements by otherwise responsible organizations like the International Biometric Society that Fisher was a eugenicist and a racist, and enough was said by using those two words to have his reputation tarnished. This crossed the Atlantic very quickly, and it got into the hands of people at University College London who had their own reasons for wanting to demolish the reputations of Francis Galton and Karl Pearson. Pearson had been a vigorous eugenicist without actually being a member of the Eugenics Society, so he didn't get criticised too much in the first place because the bad boys were all supposed to be members of the Eugenics Society in this country. And this spread even to places like Rothamsted Experimental Station, who you would think would have stopped and wondered how their most prominent scientist was suffering this fate from people who'd clearly never looked into what Fisher's contribution to eugenics was, and who certainly was not a racist in any sense at all. And finally, the students of Gonville and Caius College found out about this, and they put up a petition on the basis of misinformation, and particularly these two words which were being bandied about. And the historian fellows of Caius got involved in this, I think encouraged the students. Certainly the senior tutor is a historian and was primarily and publicly within the college context involved in preparing a justification for removing a stained glass window in the Caius Hall, which had been put up in 1989 to mark Fisher's scientific contributions. And that was particularly disgraceful because there were amongst the senior fellows of Caius people who remembered R.A. Fisher and could talk about him. Nobody consulted them. I was there who had worked in the fields in which Fisher was famous for, and using the college as a base had created a career for myself in doing that. Nobody consulted me. It was a snap decision taken by the council on the behest of the senior tutor and the master, and on the basis of total ignorance about one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century. Well, I wasn't going to have that. He was a friend of mine. You don't let a friend down. So I started informing myself to a greater extent than I had been inclined to do before as to exactly what his association with the eugenics movement was. And in doing that, I found that, as usual, he was thinking more deeply and in a more forward way than any of his contemporaries, and that his contemporaries were, for the most part, understanding perfectly well what he was saying. And his proposal for some child allowances which would not be paid for by the state, as he is accused of having said, but no, that was not the way that it was done. He argued for those against Sir William Beveridge's proposals for flat rate child allowances. Beveridge was a member of the Eugenics Society too. They argued this out as both members of the Eugenics Society, and Beveridge won, at which point Fisher really gave up. He didn't continue. But looked at from today's perspective, it's extremely interesting, because what he was concerned about was the failure of the middle classes to reproduce their numbers at a time when the population, demographers could see, was likely to start reducing round about the time of the First World War, and as a consequence, of course, of the great loss of life during the First World War. And here today now we're in exactly the same position, but we don't yet seem to be prepared to ask ourselves the question that Fisher asked: which part of the population is not reproducing itself at the appropriate rate, if things are to be stable? Well, it was an advanced thing to do. And what's more, he realized that there were, in the context of the inevitable fact that fertility itself is going to be partly a heritable quantity, there are going to be changes to the genetic composition of a population as a result of the differential fertility in the different classes. We're 100 years on now, and we still haven't started discussing this problem.
Are you winning? Are you winning this debate?
Well, I think that I and my friends are winning it in the sense of there is no risk to Fisher's reputation in the long term. None at all. I didn't resign my fellowship at Caius because I was encouraged to stand and fight. And that is what I have done, and I have argued and argued and argued. Nobody in the college has argued against me. I have been met by a wall of silence, which is not surprising, because that's the only way that my opposition can hide its ignorance. So I'm not at all concerned about Fisher's long-term reputation, but I'm extremely concerned about the reputation of Gonville and Caius College. And I suppose that that window will go back. Whether I live to see it going back is a different matter. These things take a long time. But there's no way that I want to see Gonville and Caius College in the future being remembered as the college that took down a perfectly sensible memorial to a man as great as Ronald Aylmer Fisher.
Did Gonville also purge its walls of other alumni of the college who were associated with supposedly associated in some way with the slave trade? They decided to take down a whole lot of portraits. Is that the case or not?
No, we haven't taken down any other portraits as far as... Are you talking about Caius's experience?
Caius, yes.
No, we should certainly, if there's to be any permanent removal of the Fisher portrait, we should certainly take down Francis Crick, because he was saying most objectionable things about eugenics in the 1960s, which are well recorded and conveniently forgotten.
Well, you have a window which has Venn, it has Fisher, has Crick, and I want to end the interview by saying that I hope one day it'll have Anthony Edwards in the window as well. So,
well, the only place for me to go is where Fisher is, and of course, curiously enough, I do possess one of the extensions to Venn diagrams that I've invented as a stained glass window by the same artist, Maria McLafferty, who did the 6 that were in the hall. And it can still be seen in my former Caius room's window. If you go into Tree Court, turn right at the Porter's Lodge and look straight ahead, it is still in the T1 staircase window.
So that needs to be moved into the hall.
And they would have to put it instead of Fisher. Nobody is going to have their arms or whatever put into Fisher's window except R.A. Fisher.
Good. Well, I think on that hopeful note, thank you very much indeed, Anthony. That was lovely.